We are focusing on hominin evolution for the rest of the semester. So we are going to do an introduction to what exactly a hominin is and how we recognize hominins in the fossil record. At that point, I'm going to leave you to read through the textbook about some of the models for why humans evolved the way that they did, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So first off, we are going to do a quick overview of human evolution on a grand scale. This should be a review for everyone. We've seen a slide like this a few times over the course of the semester. So human evolution, as far as we're covering it for this class, begins with the emergence of the order Primates about 60 million years ago. So we first see the earliest primate-like animals in the fossil record at about 60. Jumping forward to 25 million years ago, we have apes appearing. Great apes appearing then at 18. You should remember the distinction between great apes and just apes generally from a few weeks ago. The earliest hominins appear 5 to 7 million years ago. The term hominin is one that is important that we'll be using throughout the rest of the class. And basically what it means is everything in our lineage and in our ancestry dating back to the chimp-human split. So our lineage split with the modern chimp lineage somewhere between 5 and 7 million years ago. Everything that happens on our side of that split is included in the term hominin. Jumping forward to 3.5 million years ago, we have the genus Homo emerge, and then jumping forward again to 330,000 years ago, we have anatomically modern humans emerge. Jumping forward again to about 10,000 years ago is when we see the first agricultural practices occur in the fossil record. We don't have any kind of biological change that's required for a switch to agriculture, but we do see biological change emerge as a result of agriculture. So back in chapter 5, we talked about modern human variation. We talked about some of the examples of recent human evolution in the form of lactase persistence and stuff like that. So you're already familiar with some of that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the definition of hominins. So as it says here on the slide, the earliest possible evidence of hominins dates to the end of the Miocene. So the Miocene epoch ends around this time. It ends at about 5.3, so the very tail end of the Miocene epoch is the period of time that we're talking about here. And as it says here, again, that material includes dental and cranial pieces. So we're going to go over these species in a little bit more detail later on, but just for now, the earliest contenders for hominins, members of the hominin lineage in the earliest period of hominin evolution are pictured here. So Sahelanthropus chadensis, which is dated to about 7 million years, Auroran tugenensis, which dates to about 6, and then jumping forward a little bit to Ardipithecus, the genus Ardipithecus, which actually includes 2 separate species, so Ardipithecus cadaba and Ardipithecus ramidus. So these two that I'm indicating with the cursor here, Sahelanthropus and Auroran, are a little bit controversial. We're not actually sure, and there's not a lot of agreement in the field about whether those are actual hominins or not. We will get to the reasons why they may or may not be later. Ardipithecus, by and large, over here, dating to 4.4 to 5.6, is pretty widely accepted by most people in the field to be an early hominin. So these two might be hominins. This is most definitely a hominin, Ardipithecus is. Okay, so how do we recognize a hominin in the fossil record? If we were to find a fossil that dated to 4 million years ago, what kind of characteristics would we look for to help us identify whether it's a hominin or whether it's some other kind of ape? Maybe it's a chimp ancestor or a gorilla ancestor. So some of the distinctive hominin characteristics include those listed here. The bipedal locomotion, walking on 2 legs, having a large brain size, and forms of tool-making behavior. These are not things that all appear at once at the same time during hominin evolution. So as it says here on the slide, these are characteristics that evolved at different rates throughout the evolutionary history of hominins. Just To jump ahead, we'll talk more about this in a minute, but the first thing that evolves of these three is bipedal locomotion. So we see a shift to walking on two legs long before we see any significant increases in brain size or tool-making behavior. So this pattern of evolutionary change that we see with these functional systems and these characteristics changing over time, this pattern is described as being a pattern of mosaic evolution. So the slide has a definition here for you, a pattern of evolution in which the rates of evolution in one functional system vary from those in another. So the functional systems that we look at in hominin evolution are listed on the slide, and they include locomotion. Of course, we're talking about bipedality here, brain size increases, and some changes to the dentition. The dentition meaning the teeth. So these are the characteristics, these functional systems here are the characteristics that we're going to talk about most over the next few weeks. So we're going to talk about changes in locomotion when we start to see bipedalism emerge. We're going to talk about brain size when we start to see big leaps in brain size, and we'll talk a little bit about changes to the dentition. So what do we see happening in the mouth? How are the teeth changing over time? Okay, so what we see here is evidence, most likely, all of these anatomical changes are hinting at evidence for a behavioral shift. So what's probably happening here is that our distant ancestors start exploiting a different niche from other hominoids. So the term hominoid is a reference to, like gorilla ancestors and chimp ancestors. So our ancestors begin to differentiate because they're starting to exploit a different ecological niche. Now, an ecological niche can cover a lot of different aspects of the life of an animal, where they live, when they're awake, what they eat, what their mating cycles are, all of that kind of stuff. So for hominins in particular, we're talking about spending more time on the ground, coming down out of the trees a little bit more, and exploiting different resources. Once this trajectory starts, we start to have hominins following a different evolutionary trajectory. So we start to see these differences, these adaptations in the different lineages beginning to accumulate. So as I said before, the first thing that we look for in the hominin fossil record, if we're looking to identify a hominin, is evidence of bipedalism. So how and why did hominins become bipeds? This is the big question. So as it says here, humans are considered both habitual and obligate bipeds. Those are related terms, but they're not exactly the same thing. I do have some definitions here for you. A habitual biped, by that term I mean bipedalism is our most common form of locomotion, so it's what we engage in most often. And when we say that humans are obligate bipeds, it means that hominins cannot officially locomote any other way. So we are technically capable of crawling, for example. We're not good at it. It burns a lot of calories. It's not comfortable. We don't have the anatomical modifications that would make it an easy or energetically efficient way of moving. So that's what we mean by obligate bipeds. We're kind of locked into walking bipedally by the way that our skeleton is laid out. Again, another example might be brachiation, which we talked about earlier in the semester. This is that swinging motion that gibbons and Siamings make. We are technically capable of doing that, but if you go to a playground and you try to use the monkey bars, especially as an adult, you'll see it's not an easy way to travel. It's not something that we have the grip strength or the shoulder strength for anymore. Okay, so a quick overview of the human skeleton is listed here. We're not going to go into a lot of detail about skeletal anatomy because we don't really have time, but the adult human skeleton has 206 bones, and the bones in different parts of the body are listed there. The skull is actually made up of 22 different bones. They are fused together for the most part, so they kind of function as one functional unit, but they are 22 separate bones. The 33 bones in the vertebral column the 24 bones in the rib cage plus the sternum, 6 in the pelvis, 2 bones in each shoulder girdle, and approximately 30 bones per limb. So the 30 bones per limb would include the arm bones and the leg bones, and then all the bones in the hands and feet. Okay, so the vertebral column has changed quite a lot as we shift from quadrupedalism to bipedalism. Our current human anatomy for our vertebral column includes 24 vertebrae total, and you can see they are divided into 3 different types. The cervical vertebrae are the small kind of delicate vertebrae that you have in your neck. A little bit further down, you have 12 thoracic vertebrae. The thoracic vertebrae are the vertebrae that attach to the rib cage. And down at the base of the spine, we have 5 lumbar vertebrae. Those vertebrae are heavy, they're big, they're thick, and that is because they are weight-bearing. So they're supporting the weight of the entire upper part of the body on that structure. We also have the sacrum and the coccyx. Those are embryologically very similar to vertebrae, but they are fused. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the anatomical differences that you see between a biped and a quadruped. So as I said, if we're out in the field and we find a fossil that dates to 4 million years ago, what are we going to look for? If we want to figure out whether it's a hominin or not, what kind of characteristics are we looking for? Okay, so the first is the foramen magnum placement. The foramen magnum is pictured here. So what you're looking at on the slide are 4 examples of cranial bases. So these are the bottoms of skulls. If we were looking from the bottom up at the base of the skull, this is what you would see. So the first one is a chimp, and the last one is a modern human. The structure that we're looking for here is the foramen magnum, which is this hole that I'm indicating with the cursor here. So this is where it is on the chimp, and this is where it is on the human, the modern human. So the foramen magnum is a large hole, literally translated, foramen magnum means large hole, on the base of the cranium that the spinal cord passes through. So the spinal cord exits the brain through this hole. Now, it's in a different place on a quadruped than it is on a biped. On a quadruped, such as a chimp, this hole is towards the back of the skull. So it's in what we would call a posterior kind of position. If we look at the placement in the Homo sapiens skull here, this structure is closer to the front of the skull. So if we look at the entire shape of the skull, this structure is closer to the middle of the skull. Now, the structure is closer to the middle of the skull because our heads balance on top of our bodies. So if that hole was not in the center of the skull, it would offset the balance of our cranium basically, and we would have a hard time holding our head up. So one of the things we can look for if we find a cranium in the fossil record is we can look at the location of this hole on the base of the skull. We can look at, is it closer to the back of the skull like we see in a chimp, or is it closer to the front of the skull like we see in a modern human? Now we're just going to be going kind of from the top to the bottom. We're starting with cranial features, and we're going to go down all the way to the feet. So the next thing is the neck. We can look at some of the structures on the cervical vertebrae, those neck vertebrae. The spinous process is being pointed to by these lines here. If you feel on the back of your neck, the lumps that run down the back of your neck on your vertebral column, those are the spinous processes. As it says here, those are neck muscle attachment points. So on your cervical vertebrae, if you're sitting and you're studying and you're looking down for a few hours at the table in front of you, your neck muscles tend to get tired, right? Those muscles that are getting fatigued when you're doing that attach from those spinous processes on the vertebrae all the way up to the base of the skull. So if we're looking at those structures here in this little kind of corny drawing that I have on the slide here, you can't even really see them in the skeleton of the modern human. That's supposed to be designating how small they are relative to the structures in the quadruped here. So in a quadruped, they have these pronounced spinous processes that stick up really far. The reason, again, comes back to the function of the structures. So These structures, as I said, serve as muscle attachment points. Quadrupeds, as you can probably imagine if you're looking at this slide here, have this head that is hanging out in front of their bodies. When that head is hanging out in front of their bodies, it's requiring a lot of muscle strength to keep in place. So you have these muscles that are stretching from the spinous processes up to the base of the cranium here. And those muscles are working really hard all day long, every day, to keep the animal's head held in the proper place. In humans, in bipeds, in all bipeds that we're talking about here, we don't need those big structures, because while we do have muscles that are attaching from the base of the skull to the spinous processes, there's also a lot of balance taking place. So the head is not being held out in front of the body. The head is being balanced on top of the body. So those muscle attachment points can afford to be smaller, basically, in a human. So spinous processes are reduced in bipeds, and they tend to be larger in quadrupeds. Another thing that we have is different curvature to the vertebral column. You can see here on the slide how our vertebral columns are different than what we see in a quadrupedal ape. So in the quadrupedal ape, we have one relatively smooth curve. It's kind of a gentle C shape. And then in humans, we actually have two extra curves, but there's just really one listed here, or pictured here on the slide, the one that is designated in blue. At the base of our spine, we have this extra curvature that kind of complements the original curvature to give us kind of an S-shaped spine. Now, the importance of this basically is that it allows for us to carry our weight totally differently than a quadruped does. So our weight has to be distributed entirely differently than it does in a quadruped. So the quadruped's weight, a lot of the weight of their upper body is being kind of transmitted down through their arms. So they don't have a lot of pressure being put on their spine because their body weight is being distributed across all four limbs. If we look at the human biped here, of course, we're standing upright, so all of the pressure is all of our weight is being carried in our lower limb. So we have to have this extra curvature to our spine to pull our body upright and be able to balance all of our weight over our pelvis so that we can carry our weight in this way. Something else that we see in the vertebral column are differences to the types of vertebrae that we have. So the cervical vertebrae tend to be small and really delicate in structure. The thoracic vertebrae tend to be kind of medium-sized, medium robusticity, and then the lumbar vertebrae are large and thick. So this is a reflection of how much weight is being put on these structures. So the structures up at the top in the neck don't have as much weight. They only have to support the weight of the cranium. The thoracic vertebrae have a little bit more weight to support. And then the lumbar vertebrae have the most weight that they have to support. So those size differences are something that are unique to bipeds. Moving down, a couple things on this slide. We are looking at the shape of the pelvis and the orientation of the leg bones. So we'll talk about the pelvis first. We can see a comparison here between a chimpanzee pelvis over on the left and a Homo sapiens pelvis over on the right. So the most easy thing to notice when we're looking at these two is the orientation and the shape. So the chimpanzee pelvis is tall and narrow, and the modern human pelvis is short and wide. So this is something that's referred to as being a basin-shaped pelvis. Basically, if you think about the basin of a bathroom sink, it's kind of the same idea. It's kind of the same structure and proportion. So these changes to the pelvis are again reflecting different weight distributions. So if we look over here back at this slide, all of our weight is being carried in the pelvis. So the pelvis has to be wider to accommodate all of that weight and to be able to kind of center our center of gravity where it should be. So the pelvis shape is different. We're also looking at the orientation of the thigh bones here. So the thighs of a chimpanzee are parallel. These femora, these thigh bones are parallel to each other. The bone kind of articulates with the pelvis here and drops straight down to the knee. Our thigh bones are oriented differently. So they're angled in at the knee. We have this angled effect here, which again comes back to where our center of gravity is being carried. So the result of having this angle to the thigh bones is that we have something called a valgus knee. So the valgus knee is a reference to this angle here. So our thigh bones cut in, and then the shin bones go straight down from there. So our shin bones are actually parallel to each other, but our thigh bones are not. So the valgus knee is what we have as humans. The varus knee here is what that means basically is that there is no angle to the thigh bones. Everything is parallel. So the femora or thigh bones are parallel, and the shin bones are parallel as well. As far as the feet go, chimpanzees, of course, still have their opposable toe. We do not. We lost ours. It's moved back into line with the rest of the toes. This is helpful for bipedalism because it helps us balance. It helps also with propulsion when we're walking from foot to foot. We also have arches that quadrupeds do not have. We have two arches in our feet. One goes from front to back. Sometimes it's called the anterior-posterior or longitudinal arch. Again, front to back. Mediolateral or transverse arch goes from side to side. So basically these arches serve a couple of different functions. As it says here in the little caption, our feet function kind of like a three-legged platform or a tripod, which is a pretty stable structure. These arches serve to absorb force when we're walking, and they also help us to have for lack of a better term, like a spring to our step. So it helps kind of propel us forward when we're walking from foot to foot. So this is what we just went through, all contained on one slide. So when you're studying, you can look back at this. Again, it might be kind of helpful to you to think in terms of going from the head down to the feet. What changes are we seeing in the skeleton from the head all the way down to the feet? Because our bodies have changed. Basically, our entire body plan has changed over the last 7 million years. So in terms of why bipedalism evolved, your book does a really good job of covering these models, kind of succinctly covering these models. So we're not going to go over them in these voice recorded lectures, but make sure that you are reading those sections in the book. There is information in the slides about them, but the book will definitely help you with that.